Welcome back to Flourishing in Medicine from Surviving to Thriving. I'm your host, Dr. Mick Krasner. This podcast is brought to you by EmPro, a medical professional liability insurance company headquartered in New York State. EmPro is committed through a number of peer support offerings to supporting the physicians they protect.
I think we leave a lot of opportunity, innovation, we leave a lot of quality on the table when we create these spaces and promote spaces that don't encourage people to bring their authenticity. Healthcare is so complex, and it's increasingly complex. The idea that a single person has an all-knowing perspective, it's just not even logical. What I love about relational leadership is, as Jane mentioned, the practices that you start to engage in, what they really do is they open up a space for all of the folks on the team, including the patient, the caregiver, everyone who's present, to feel that their contributions truly are seen, heard, and valued.
In this episode of Flourishing in Medicine from Surviving to Thriving, I'm joined by physician leader Sarah Smithson and organizational leadership expert Jane Cooper-Driver for a rich, reflective conversation on relational leadership and why it matters for clinician flourishing. Drawing from Sarah's formative experiences in medicine and Jane's cross-cultural background and work in organizational transformation, the discussion explores how relationships, not just structures or transactions, shape meaning, trust, psychological safety, and well-being in healthcare. Together, they contrast relational leadership with traditional hierarchical models, examine how relational breakdowns contribute to burnout and moral distress, and highlight how intentional, teachable practices can transform conflict into creativity, teams into communities, and work into a shared endeavor rooted in belonging, care, and collective resilience. And now, my conversation with Sarah Smithson and Jane Cooper-Driver. So welcome again to Flourishing in Medicine, Sarah and Jane. I'm so excited to have you join us for this conversation today.
Thank you, Mick. Excited to be with you.
Very, very excited to be here. Thanks for this opportunity.
You know, I wanted to just sort of set the stage a little bit. That today we're going to be exploring relational leadership and why it matters, what it is, and how it connects to flourishing for physicians and health professionals. And I wanted to actually have our listeners kind of hold an idea during the time that we have to spend with each other. And that idea is the following: with curiosity, the idea that when the quality of our relationships improve, something shifts, not just in the teams we work, but in how we ourselves experience work. So I like folks to hold on to that. And Sarah, I'm going to ask both of you this question. I begin the conversations this way, but we'll start with you, Sarah. Why medicine? You know, when you look back and first think about what first pulled you toward medicine as a career, early experiences, maybe something that was formative in your life or even educationally when you were beginning that journey. Just a little bit about not so much the biography, but what it is that about you that was drawn to it.
It's been fun to reflect on that prior to this conversation. And I was one of those little kids that wanted to be a doctor from the time that I was really young. And knowing this, I remember my mom, she went back to school as an adult for her degree in physical therapy, and she got permission for me to join her in the cadaver lab when she was doing dissections. And for me, I just remember being, first of all, being intimidated. I was in, I think, 8th grade when I had this opportunity. So to go into a cadaver lab was both exciting and I'd never been in that kind of situation before. So to go in and then have the opportunity to, hold a human lung in my hand. And I remember it feeling like a sponge and just pressing it down and watching it reinflate and being really mesmerized and thinking, okay, I already knew that I was fascinated by science and that I wanted to give back, but that was an experience that really kind of solidified it for me. And then my stepmom is a social worker, my dad is a public aid attorney. So that idea and modeling of we should take our skills and talents and use them in service of others to give back, combined with that fascination with science, for years just pointed me in that direction of medicine and has been something that I've really enjoyed.
Thank you. I love your description of the cadaver lab, and especially that lung. It's such a physical sensation that I experienced as you were talking. And I just would like to ask, not everyone would have had the same reaction in that cadaver lab that you had. So I'm just thinking, maybe underneath that fascination with science, what was it about you, or maybe your kind of the milieu you grew up in, that made that like so fascinating? What do you know about yourself, maybe virtues or qualities that made that really cool?
I think there's also a part of me that if someone even implies like, well, this will be too hard, or you won't do that, or you're not capable of achieving that. There's this little piece of me that says, oh, really? I'll show you, for better or worse. And so I think that idea of, you know, I remember my mom saying, are you sure? You know what's in a cadaver lab, right? Are you sure you want to go in there? And then not just that, but pursuing medicine. I didn't have other physicians in my family, and I worked as a medical unit clerk, which was also really influential because I got to sit, at the desk on a medical unit, entering the orders, answering the phones, and seeing the whole medical team around me. And I remember at times sharing with physicians that would come and go that I too wanted to be a physician. And there were plenty of times that, I mean, no one ever physically patted me on the head and said, like, okay, sweetheart, but that was kind of the impression I got, which I think only fueled my desire more to say, I understand this is going to be a challenging path, and I can do it. And I think that's because, credit to my parents, they never ever doubted or expressed doubt about what I could accomplish. They always expressed that they had faith and confidence in me, which was really powerful.
Yeah, there's sort of, I'm getting a sense of a tenacious quality you have, but also this can-do sense that was supported by your family. They really didn't want to put any barriers on that. Jane, your work has always lived at the intersection of individual and cultural transformation. So, what led you there? And not just like, where did you go to school and how did you get that? What was it about you, really? I'm talking about like who we are that brings us to this work. What was about you that really, that made sense to you completely?
For me, it started, gosh, a long time ago. So I moved to this country. We immigrated to this country when I was 7. And it was me, my older brother, who was 12, and then my mom. My mom got a position at Boston University, which brought us to Massachusetts. And my father and stepmother and the rest of my cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents all remained in the UK. And so from that early age, I can remember sort of walking out of Logan Airport, and the cars were bigger, people were smiling, the sun was shining. There was all of these sort of very, very different symbols of I'm no longer in London. I'm now in a completely different environment. And from that day, honestly, until this day, I have continued to go back and forth between the two countries. So my brother ultimately moved back, my mother moved back. And even during my childhood, I would spend summers in the UK with my father, and my academic year was here in the US. And I think or I know actually, that experience started my fascination with culture. It just started my fascination with these very small differences, but that can have such a huge impact. And then also the importance of having a sense of belonging and sort of knowing where you fit, and sometimes knowing where you don't fit, and sort of what is my responsibility to help myself feel a sense of belonging, but then also help others feel that sense as well. And so I think that sort of led me into a real deep passion around what makes individuals tick and a curiosity around that. And I'll say over the years, my work has that sort of morphed away, not away, but it's sort of morphed into organizational cultures and sort of understanding the differences and the difficulties in starting a culture from scratch, or how do you transform or change different rituals and practices that are within those different spaces. For me, healthcare came later. So I've been in this world for over a decade now, but definitely later in my career. Ironically, my grandmother and grandfather were both general practitioners in Southwest England, and they started a clinic together. And my grandmother was one of the first women to graduate from University of London School of Medicine. So a lot of history in the healthcare space. And yet I was not in that space until about just over a decade ago. And now I can't imagine being anywhere else.
Both of you come from different pathways, medicine, organizational leadership, and then you've converged around this idea. And if you could just for us define relational leadership, not as a theory, but as something that's a living thing, if you could. And then I'm going to ask Sarah a follow-up about that. Yeah.
So the sort of formal definition of relational leadership is that it's a human-centered approach to working with others that cultivates connection, collaboration, and it's really focused on, it does all of this to increase people's sense of belonging and to ultimately impact healthcare and the system of healthcare. I would say that what I think of when I think about what is relational leadership, it's so much, but it's a set of, there's sort of a mindset, there are a set of small and larger practices and skills and behaviors that each of us can already probably do many of them. And then there are others that we don't do and that we can learn quite quickly that can really positively impact how we collaborate, how we communicate, and how we work together within healthcare teams, particularly. I think it comes to life in the smallest moments of just truly, when you ask somebody how they are, really meaning that you want to know how they are. And so being present, listening with curiosity and understanding, not sort of a throwaway. And it also, there's elements of, and Sarah just beautifully shared kind of a story of self, sort of sharing a part of you with others so that they understand more about why you do the work you do or what you bring into this space. So those are the things that come to mind. Like, I hope that's starting to answer the question for you.
Oh yeah, I think so very much. And as you're describing, like when you say, how are you, and really mean it, or we all know what it feels like to receive a hug that's perfunctory, or one that actually somebody's really, really cares about you. And now with Sarah coming from within the healthcare system as a physician, seeing probably other models of leadership, or maybe not even modeled leadership, but just sort of organic, how it is in traditional medical models. Maybe you can just talk about what distinguishes this model of leadership from what you were seeing, what was extant as you sort of was trained and began practicing clinical medicine. And what are some of the core relational capacities of relational leadership that you see are really essential?
Great question. And I'm trying to even consider about where to begin because there's so much contrast, in my opinion, between relational leadership and the traditional leadership practices that I experienced in medicine. And it's just ironic to me because we practice in healthcare, and I find that the care part is increasingly absent from how we show up together. And to me, relational leadership is foundational to demonstrating not just our care for patients, but our care for each other. And so when I reflect on the models that I've often seen, or the models that are kind of lauded as the way to show up as a leader in healthcare, especially from a physician perspective, which is the perspective that I'm most familiar with, traditionally, I think it's kind of the put on the white coat, and the white coat is akin to the cape. You're the superhero. You should be all knowing. You should be at the head of the bed or the head of the table. And if someone has a question, you as an individual should know all the answers. And I think if we step back, we know that is not practical, that is not realistic. And in fact, what I love about relational leadership is, as Jane mentioned, the practices that you start to engage in, what they really do is they open up a space for all of the folks on the team, including the patient, the caregiver, everyone who's present, to feel that their contributions truly are seen, heard, and valued. Because I think healthcare is so complex, and it's increasingly complex. The idea that a single person has an all-knowing perspective, it's just not even logical, right? And we pride ourselves in medicine on an evidence-based approach. To me, we need these tools that open up the capacity in the space for a variety of perspectives to come to the table and help arrive at more nuanced solutions to complex problems. And so to me, I feel like this traditional approach of a single all-knowing leader, it just does not fit the true practice of medicine.
I'm thinking as you're talking, I was thinking about a couple of qualities that we find in maybe more traditional leadership, but a lot of it is that you're pointing to, for me, sounded like power, hierarchy, and then this maybe a movement with this approach toward authenticity in a certain kind of way. And I don't know the study itself, but if I can find it, I'll include it in the show notes. But it was something about, what are the factors that a lot of physicians feel most significantly leads to problems like burnout. And one of the ones that comes to the top, if I remember correctly, has to be not being valued by your organization. So I thought maybe if we can bring this into the lived reality of physicians and other health professionals for a moment, and maybe Sarah, starting with you, what do you see as the most clear relational breakdowns that occur that really contribute to, we could call it burnout, we can call it moral injury, moral distress, we just can call it dysfunctional work environments. What do you think, what do you see as the most common relational breakdowns that this kind of approach may address?
I think from an interpersonal context, you hit the nail on the head. I was actually just in a coaching session yesterday, and the physician that I was coaching was expressing this tension between one of her top values being authenticity, but feeling that in the context of the power and hierarchy of medicine, there was some risk for her to show up in an authentic way. And so I think we leave a lot of opportunity, innovation, we leave a lot of quality on the table when we create these spaces and promote spaces that don't encourage people to bring their authenticity. Now, on a logistical or structural level, I think that healthcare has become increasingly transactional. And don't get me wrong, we need transactions in medicine in order for it to function, right? We need to write a prescription and have that prescription filled. We need billing to happen and bills to get paid. This is all true. But I think increasingly transactions have become prioritized over relationships. And really, relationships are the foundational core of any form of change, innovation. And honestly, when we are connecting with patients, often, and I'm a primary care doctor, so I think about the context in which I converse with patients, it's usually about change, behavioral change, then we can expand that to promoting change on our teams and think even broader than that about system level change. It all comes back to relationships, and our system is really designed more around transactions than around relationships.
Yeah, you're describing a landscape that's complex and isn't, and not to create binaries. And I think that's really important, that it's going to be either all transactional or all relationship centered, if we could use that descriptor. The other thing I'm thinking about is, it's really not helpful knowing that how challenging healthcare is and how challenging clinical medicine is, and our listeners are going to be mostly clinicians, that it's really unrealistic to think that, if we acquire these approaches, that it will all be rainbows and unicorns, right? I think it's very unrealistic. So I was going to ask Jane, being an organizational person, understanding how people function with each other, how does relational leadership show up in the inevitable, in fact, the very common moments of conflict, strain, and uncertainty that are just part of the ecosystem? And most of us that are in medicine realize wasn't a path of ease that we were choosing.
I think one of the core places where there's a disconnect is in the communication, right? And it's the communication from, if it's the senior leadership down, or if it's sort of, and I'm even using a hierarchical sort of expression there, which I don't mean, but that there's communication breakdowns that I think often are at the root of much of these concerns and issues. And you match that with perhaps a lack of trust, or a lack of safety or psychological safety for individuals. And I think all of that is just creates this mixture of angst and conflict. And I would say that a few things when I think about the work of relational leadership is that we are so focused on how do you build relationships between people. So from the individual to the team to the sort of system, that is the trust and the psychological safety between those groups becomes so strong that when communication breaks down, there's almost a grace that's given to one another. And also there's sort of a belief that it's as much my responsibility to seek out the information as it is for you to share that information with me. And so there's, Sarah and I talk about, and many others do as well, but this concept of sort of sense of agency and what can I do to really influence the world around me? And then what are those things that I need to, that, obviously I can do certain things. And then there's others that also need to meet me halfway as well. So, but I definitely think communication is one of the core elements that we really either overtly or covertly focus on when you think about some of the practices that we're teaching.
I've been spending, as you know, about a third of my time in the New York metro area, which is where I am right now. And I'm not from here, and I never spent a lot of time here. And I don't drive here, but I pick up a Lyft or an Uber. And I've noticed driving here is a unique experience in a lot of ways. But although there's a sense of aggression in the driving, there's also an incredible, you named it, grace. Like, people need to move in and people aren't happy about it, but they let people do it.
They do.
And change. Like, they totally make space. And even the use of the horn here is a communication tool, not an expression of anger. Sometimes it's an expression of anger, but I've really been really contemplating, what is that? It's a different way of communicating, and it's being in relationship in a different way. And I think we have to maybe in some ways expand kind of the landscape of the boundaries, or how we frame, what it means to be in relationship.
You're also describing sort of the subtle nuances and the differences, right? The rituals that are in New York that aren't in somewhere else potentially. And you're sort of a foreigner in this space. And how do you navigate it? How do you understand it? And I think that's the same when you think about healthcare teams. And every time you bring a group together, there's sort of this, okay, can we co-create what those rituals are going to be, or are they imposed upon us because this is what the culture is? And so I find that is the pieces that I find so interesting. And then I think with relational leadership, we really are focused on how do you co-create those rituals together so that everybody's voice is in the mix and everyone's sort of their needs are being considered as you craft how it is that you want to interact. And so, but love that example of the Uber drivers and such.
I think the other thing that we tend to frame managing conflict as conflict transformation rather than conflict resolution. And I think in healthcare, it's particularly pertinent because I find the majority of folks who I talk to in healthcare are conflict averse. They want to avoid conflict at all costs. When in reality, if you are in a space where everyone agrees, it's likely that you actually are in a space that does not have psychological safety. And if people can't bring diverse opinions to the table, like on those New York streets, there is no one way for all of these people to navigate those streets. And they are essentially transforming conflict through this form of communication to create a patchwork of navigation that is probably changing very dynamically. Some people are going to like it, some people are not. And so I think that analogy in healthcare is also true, right? When we are really effectively transforming and navigating conflict, we are developing even more creativity and innovation and identifying different ways to do things than if everyone's in agreement and we sit there kind of, quote unquote, politely and quietly.
I was thinking about, it also reminded me of an experience I had. I attended a couple workshops with a writer, poet named David White. You may have heard of him. He was describing a story once where he was giving a talk and someone in the audience, at the end of the talk just said, "I think you're just a crock." And he started to walk away. He came up to him and said, "I just think what you're saying is ridiculous. You're just a crock." And he walked away. And David followed him and he tapped him on the shoulder and says, "Wait a second. You can't leave now." He says, "Why?" He says, "Because we have a relationship now." It's sort of the beginning of that relationship. It wasn't the end that he's going to walk away. It's like, that's the starting point. And sometimes that is the starting point for us. So one of the assumptions, and really both of you, I'd love to hear from both of you about this. One of the assumptions in healthcare, I think, is that these relational skills are somewhat innate. Some people got them, some people don't, or they're optional. They're not that important. So just the whole idea, if you can talk a little bit about, can this approach be taught, and what gives you hope in healthcare education and leadership that this could be integrated into how we relate to each other to really move the systems toward better functioning?
Nick, you're absolutely right. So often people think, well, I'm a nice person, and these people around me in healthcare, they're nice people, and we're smart, we know a lot. So if we just show up together, it's going to work out great. And, I have a colleague who did a little pilot in her clinic. She's a family medicine physician. She's been doing relational leadership work for over a decade. So exceptionally skilled. And she was really surprised when she did a survey of the medical assistants on her clinical team that they did not express the levels of psychological safety that she expected. And she now has very intentionally implemented practices like huddles, asking for feedback directly, hearing that feedback, reiterating it, engaging it, implementing it with real intentionality. And so we're curious to see the post-survey results. And what that really exemplified for me is, she's an incredible physician, so open, so welcoming, thoughtful, an excellent partner. And even all those qualities need intentionality around the practices. So yes, absolutely. I think these practices can be taught, and then you can pull them out of your toolkit based on what feels most authentic to you and what fits the scenario you're in the best. Jane, what would you add?
Agree with everything that you just shared. I think a couple of thoughts come to mind. One is that, and I think it's Tony Suckman who has done research or has a research paper who talks about the sort of percentage of time that QI initiatives fail. And the reason they fail is not because of necessarily the work that's being done, but because of the people interactions or the lack of people interactions. And so I think that when people feel like this is a nice to have, not a must have, some of these techniques and skills, I think there's enough evidence to show that they are essential, absolutely essential. I think another thought that comes to mind for me is often people see these as, oh, well, now I'm going to work on this over here, my relational skills, and then I'll get back to my actual work, right? And what we're really trying to do, and many that are doing this work alongside us, is show how they're integrated. This is not two separate sort of parts of your brain working. This is actually, how do you integrate relational practices into your huddle? How do you do a check-in? How do you make sure you're sharing facilitation so that it's not just one person at the head of the table all the time? Like, just very, very small things that I think for many will be, well, that's so simple. How can it be so simple? But and I just want to underline, bold, capital letters, the word intentionality. I think that without that, we just get lax, and it ends up that some of these conflicts and issues start to arise. So the intentionality is absolutely critically important, and belief that this is important work as well, or in addition or alongside the work that one is doing. So those are the things that come to mind.
Yeah, I think it's really important what you pointed out is this way we tend to compartmentalize skills. And, we even talk about work-life balance as if we're not living when we're at work, or we're not living when we're not working when we're outside of work. And of course we are doing all of that. And it's more like work-life integration. I don't know if you remember seeing Freaky Friday, which at the opening scene, Jamie Lee Curtis is the do-it-all. She's doing everything, and you see her sitting, she's doing her meditation, and meanwhile at the same time she's painting her nails. So she's trying to get everything done. You see her taking a few breaths, and then she's blowing on the nails. So as if you put a little attention here, that's going to work. And I think what you point out so effectively is that it's really about a way of being in relationship, is what you're talking about, and that we actually know how to be in relationship because we've been doing it since we were born. In fact, we as a species, it's really, really, really important for our survival to be in relationship. Our survival depends on it. So I don't think it's something that is a separate skill. It's actually part of our endowment, wouldn't you say?
I would definitely say that is true. I think this is where I think that sometimes the culture or the sort of the rituals or structures of an organization pull that out. And, it could be the workflow processes, it could be the technology that you're using, it could be a lot of different, it could be that it's not rewarded or encouraged for you to build strong relationships with others. And so it's almost like we have created a system in some places, not everywhere. So I recognize that, but in some places where being too close or too relational is not okay. And so I think it's making people go against the grain or against what their natural tendencies might be. And then I would say, and both of you will know this much, much better than I would, I think even within medical education, I think that there's an important emphasis on the relationship with the patient, but and I think this is definitely changing, but in the past, it was less so about your relationship with your other team colleagues and how you work and collaborate. And I think interprofessional education is obviously changing and transforming. And you still have quite a few individuals that came out of the past system and are working within healthcare right now. So I think it's absolutely a natural way that we want to be and we want to show up. And yet I think that there's so many different factors that are pushing against that. But I'd be fascinated to see what, Sarah, your thoughts are.
Yeah, we see this and we feel it honestly every moment of every day in healthcare, right? And even consider the last time you walked into a clinical space as a patient or a caregiver. When you walked in, did you feel seen, heard, valued? Did you feel cared for? to your point, as humans, we have our antennas up for this feeling constantly. And when you walk into a clinical space, there's a vulnerability associated with that because often you're showing up because you're worried about your health, you're unwell, you don't know what's going on. And if you walk into that space and you don't feel cared for, that has implications for your willingness to open up. And this is typically transmitted by, for example, how you're greeted at the front desk. Well, what's influencing that? I think, does that person at the front desk feel seen, heard, valued, and cared for? And if the answer is no, the natural experience is for that to become very transactional. And so you start to recognize how the way we treat each other on the care team translates very directly to how patients and caregivers, who are also, of course, a part of the team when we're really functioning at the highest level, and you start to see the nuances of how we all feel when we show up together in a space, how that can very directly influence the quality of the care, the clinical outcomes, and even how desirable of a place that clinic or organization is for employees and for patients. So you start to get a sense of how truly foundational relationships are in the work that we do. They're not optional, as you both have said, they're not nice to have, they are critical.
Very well said. Very clear. Thank you. We're coming down to really the final part of our conversation here, unfortunately, because it's been a lovely time together. But I thought I'd ask you to do a little thought exercise with me. Imagine it's 3-5 years from now, some number of time from now, and our healthcare ecosystem has been incredibly successful in building leadership, relational leadership. It functions effectively with high quality and meaning and engagement among its staff. This may be the farthest thing from current experience, maybe not, but if you could just imagine that. So I'd just like each of you to reflect on what would it like to be working in this kind of environment as a health professional or a manager, a leader, and what would a more relationally grounded healthcare system make possible for everyone, patients, staff, etc. And then, so that's the first part. And then the second part, if you can stay with it, what would we have had to learn in that 3-5 years, however many years? What are the key things we'd have to learn to get there?
As an individual, I would feel an opportunity to grow, that I have an opportunity to really thrive in this environment, that my opinion matters, my thoughts matter, that even when I make a mistake, I'm supported, that our turnover would go down, our resiliency would go up, the climate surveys within the organization would be off the charts. And so there's a sense of really important work and enjoyable work. That doesn't mean that there isn't conflict, there isn't disagreement. In fact, hopefully there's plenty of that, and we are able to move through that really, really well. And I do think that there are examples of this that exist today. I think that there are some large organizations that are trying to move towards this kind of an environment.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree with that. And I think the thing that I would add is we would all, right, every team member, again, including the patient and the caregiver, would feel like we were part of something greater and bigger. And maybe this is a little controversial. I think we would feel love. Like we would feel, to your point, Jane, that we're going into a space where we don't have all the answers, but that's okay because there's a collective team around us and we all understand that we're moving towards a common goal. And if I trip or fall down, no one's going to leave me behind. They're going to pick me up and say, "Come on, I got you." And that, we talk a lot about well-being and burnout and resilience. Like that resilience would not be about an individual's characteristics. It would live within the team. The team would carry each other forward. And whether you were an employee or a patient, you would feel it the same as you entered the space. And I think what would have to change in the next few years would be, again, this is a transactional space we're in. We really need to understand the measures that demonstrate that we're making progress here and effectively then communicate that to the decision makers and translate it to the bottom line, because our institutions do have to be financially sustainable. I absolutely believe that when we engage in these practices, we increase the financial productivity and sustainability of our institutions. And so the next question becomes, how do we most effectively and efficiently demonstrate that?
Wonderful thoughts. This is really, in some ways, a starting point. And I want to thank you both for a brilliant and interesting and delightful conversation together. And I wanted to say, I'm kind of forming an idea about flourishing, really having a lot to do with not optimizing everything, but really the center of it has to do with connection, with belonging, with being in relationship, with our shared humanity, and things flow from that. So getting there is the big question, and you both are doing work in that space, which is so important and vital. And thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mick.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening. We will include a summary of today's podcast and links to Sarah Smithson and Jane Cooper Driver and their company, Relational Leadership Partners, in the show notes. I'd like to conclude by sharing another practical exercise to help you flourish. I invite you right now just to pause for a moment wherever you are. You could think of this as simply arriving. You might begin by just noticing your breath, not doing anything with it, not changing it, just sensing that you're breathing. Now gently bring to mind a moment at work, perhaps a recent interaction when you felt truly seen, heard, valued. And if that's hard to find, think of a moment when you offered that presence to someone else. Either way, noticing what happens in your body as you remember that moment. Perhaps you're experiencing a softening, a settling, or a sense of connection. And if it feels right, consider the following question, not to answer, but to just hold on to it. What might become possible in my work, on my team, or with my patients if I brought just a little more presence into my next interaction? When you're ready, let the question go and gently return to the rest of your day. Remembering that connection is not extra to the work. Connection is the work. I hope you found this podcast and the simple exercise useful to you, and look forward to having you join us for the next episode of Flourishing in Medicine, from Surviving to Thriving. If you'd like to learn more about EmPro, please visit www.myempro.com. To learn more about EmPro's support programs for its peers, www.myempro.com/peer-support. If you're a physician or a medical student in need of urgent support, please consider calling the Physician Support Line at 1-888-409-0141. This support line provides safe space to discuss immediate life stressors with volunteer psychiatrist colleagues who are uniquely trained in mental wellness and have similar shared experiences of the profession. For more information about me and my work, visit www.mickkrasnermd.com or www.mindfulpracticeinmedicine.com. I look forward to seeing you for our next episode.